The annual report to Congress on international religious freedom, the International Religious Freedom Report, describes the status of religious freedom in every country. The report covers government policies violating religious belief and practices of groups, religious denominations and individuals, and U.S. policies to promote religious freedom around the world, in accordance with the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. And this enormous mandate lies squarely on the shoulders of Rabbi David Saperstein, who assumed the position of Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom at the start of 2015. I am delighted to have him join us now to talk about this report specifically and about his important work in general. David, welcome back to State of Belief Radio.
Always delighted to be with you and with your listeners.
Well, let's start with a brief history of the annual report and what the goals are. This is a report that you write. Tell me, has this been done before? Is this the first time? And what are the goals of doing it?
Sure. The report was mandated by the legislation that you and I worked on, the International Religious Freedom Act, that passed in 1998, and there's been a report ever since. So this is about the 16th, 17th report. It is the goal is first to evaluate the challenges to religious freedom in 199 countries across the globe, every country that we are engaged with across the globe, and to lift up the plight of those who face discrimination, persecution, harassment, societal hostility, and to put a human face on it. Mm-hmm. In doing so, it is an extraordinary affirmation of the plight of segments of communities, usually religious minorities, who are often helpless, vulnerable, oppressed, and feel totally isolated. And this kind of lifts up their story, and we hear from people around the world the enormous encouraging impact that it has. Secondly, because the report requires staff, political officers, foreign service officers in each of our embassies and a number of our consulates to actually research these issues and connect with these minority communities, oppressed communities. We hear from those communities over and over again that before this process began, we never had anyone to go to. Now we all know somebody in the embassy. This is a person who's reached out to us, who's learned about our struggles, who, when we have problems, we can ask to intervene with the government, to encourage the government to be more responsive to the infringement, to combating infringements on our religious freedom or changing their own rules and regulations. And that is enormously encouraging and reassuring to us. I would indicate also we have informal conversations from foreign ministries around the world who can't produce their own report like this, who tell us that they send it out to their field staff in their embassies across the globe. That's kind of a helpful model and blueprint for how they can go about the work of enhancing religious freedom. Mm-hmm. And finally, over the years, if you think about the 16, 17 years of foreign service officers that have had to do this research, it means we've built a kind of religious literacy amongst many foreign service officers who, over this period of time now, a number of those people have become deputy chiefs of mission or ambassadors to other countries. And taken together, it has had an enormous positive impact on behalf of the struggle for religious freedom across the globe.
David, I'm curious as to what the norm is. What do you look at? Religious freedom has become such a malleable term that we get all kinds of different definitions of it. And I know in the international community, some people use the term religious freedom, and then there are other terms in their own language they use. So when you're looking at the norm of religious freedom, are you looking at what the First Amendment to the Constitution talks about, or do you also allow for some of the definitions that could even bleed over into contradicting human rights issues?
Not entirely sure. It could be a range of things you have in mind asking the question. Right now, we, in general, we use the definitions that are in international treaties, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and that protects the right to worship, the right to talk about your religion, the right to choose your religion, so the right to convert as well. It's more than just what happens in a house of worship and the right to worship. It's a right to believe. It's a right to express those beliefs, to live in accordance with those beliefs, so long as they do not interfere with anyone else's. So the definition that we use is a robust definition in this regard. The actual language in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And this right includes the right to change his religion or belief and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or in private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. That's a pretty broad definition of religious freedom, and one that the United States is proud to have helped shape, both with our own First Amendment guarantees of religious freedom that have meant so much to religious communities, not only in our own nation, but as a model across the globe here. I would also just point out one other thing in that underlies the assumptions of this that you see in the cases decided by international human rights courts, that the fundamental concept of America's notion of religious freedom, embodied in the Establishment Clause, keeping government out of religion, embodied in the promise of free exercise of religion, and embodied in the bar in the Constitution to a religious test for office, was this revolutionary idea in the 1770s, 1780s, that your rights as a citizen would never depend upon your religious beliefs, your religious identity, your religious practices. It was an extraordinary, and even in our own country, it took us a long time to get there. We had religious establishments for many decades in some of the New England states, and it took us into the 1940s and 50s until the Supreme Court began to put real muscle behind interpretations of that promise. But in doing so, it has given religious minorities in this country more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities than they've probably known anywhere else in world history, and it has been a model and an inspiration to many other countries across the globe, and we fight every day to implement that promise in every country across the globe in our interactions with the governments and religious communities of those nations.
Well, David, as would be predictable, you nailed it. That's exactly what I was talking about. And the background of the question was simply that we are now in this nation in a robust dialogue about what exactly the First Amendment on religious freedom means. And so that I wanted to be clear when you talked about religious freedom, what people should be thinking about. And you just described it precisely. I can't imagine how you did this, and I want to ask you, you get appointed to this great position. You're exactly the right person for it, and you walk in that office and you're looking at 199 countries and you're looking at all kinds of situations. How did you decide where to begin, and how do you make decisions about what gets in this report and what doesn't?
A great question. The The report by this point is well established. We have our report, and as you know, the legislation also created the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom that I'm proud to serve on again. I served early on, but I'm proud to serve on again ex officio as the ambassador. And they do their own report. They focus on the more problematic countries across the globe. We cover every country, and we have a template where we're looking for facts. We don't make judgments in this report, but other than the implicit sense of when the rights I described were being violated or limited or unable to be exercised. But then we provide the facts of what's going on. What are the government practices? What are the government laws? How does the government implement those laws? What kind of rules and regulations do they have? And how do those rules and regulation in practice, in real life, how do they get implemented in actually affecting the day-to-day life of religious communities in that nation? And then we look at the issue of social hostilities. In the Central African Republic, Christian militias over the last few years have episodically attacked Muslim communities, and Muslim militias have responded. In many countries across the globe, there are attacks on minority Christian communities, or depending on the country, it could be on minority Muslim communities where there are hate crimes against them, and these don't come from the government. The question for us is then, what is the government doing to try and ease those hostilities, build greater religious understanding, spur and support interfaith cooperation, hold people accountable so that there's not an atmosphere of impunity against people who will take law into their own hand because they think their religion justifies that. So those are the things that we're looking at. And then finally, we talk about in each country, what is the embassy in that country or the State Department doing to try and address the challenges that they face to religious freedom.
David, I want to get into some of those details in just a moment, but I also want to know at this point, in your work, do you go beyond just cataloging what you see? Do you actually try to drive change in some of these communities?
Well, that's the other part of the work. We were focused on the report, and the report itself
right.
sometimes by lifting up problems that have been under the radar screen helps evolve conditions that lead to change. But every day, my staff here, I have a staff of 25 very gifted, very talented, dedicated people covering every region across the globe, and within that region, every country across that globe has somebody who's assigned to it and is monitoring what is happening in that country. But in every embassy and consulate, there are people working day in and day out on behalf of building civil society and ensuring more human rights and more religious freedom, and we do so by working with the civil societies of those countries and trying to strengthen their efforts in engaging with government officials where we see rules and regulations that we think violate into the obligations of that country under international human rights obligations that they have. We try to push them to make changes. It's often hard these days. There are a lot of factors that drive countries to become more restrictive. The threat of terrorism, and the often the restrictions that governments out of fear of terrorism will impose on the population in general, or on targeted communities that they're particularly worried about in particular. And so there are real challenges to doing it this day, and we're seeing the civil society space in many countries across the globe being restricted by either authoritarian countries or countries countries who are frightened by terrorism or other sources of instability in the country. And we try to make the argument that the more you try to drive human rights and religious life underground, the less transparency you're going to have. And the more your country's going to be destabilized. And we're engaged with governments every day on such issues, and sometimes it has a very helpful impact. And in those times you realize, wow, we've made life easier for millions of people or for a small minority group who no one else really would have been focused on or caring about. In that sense, it is an immensely gratifying responsibility to work here in the International Religious Freedom Office of the State Department.
Well, in doing that work, the helping with change, and then also in putting together this report, after a year and a half on this job, what have you identified as some of the most pressing issues regarding religious freedom?
Beginning in our report last year and continuing this year, we've clearly lifted up the threat to religious freedom that every one of your listeners is too keenly aware of, which is the threat from non-state actors like ISIL, Boko Haram, militant Buddhist groups. Here, as I said, the militias in Central African Republic, Al-Shabaab, all of these groups, who often in the name of religion are willing to use force to impose their views on others, to drive those who disagree with them out of the region in ethnic cleansing, to engage in horrible crimes against humanity or war crimes against targeted, usually minorities, in some cases majorities in any given country or region, and with a horrific toll. And we've all seen that. One of the things we're, I think, in this office particularly proud of is that the Secretary turned to us when considering his question of whether or not to make a determination about genocide in Iraq to ask for the entire State Department and the entire U.S. government to assist them in making that determination, but particularly charge our office to help put together the information that he would need to make the determination. And that just speaks to the enormity of the threat to religious freedom when people are being ethnically cleansed or killed or butchered or raped or forced to convert or forced to marry when women are being kidnapped, here all in the name of some religious set of beliefs that they will tolerate absolutely no differences on and use the worst kind of crimes in imposing their view on others. So that's the first thing that we've lifted up. This year in our report, we focused as well on the issues of laws on blasphemy, apostasy, and blasphemy, apostasy, and laws against defamation of religion. All of these laws that governments pass put people under criminal indictment for simply expressing what their beliefs are. I mean, if their beliefs are offensive to the religious beliefs of the majority or wherever has power in that particular country or state or region, then it can often lead to a blasphemy charge. And yet the right to speak your religious beliefs is protected by freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and vitally important that we begin to push back on these laws. And we've been doing that over a number of years, and we continue to do this. But there are countries where people can be put into prison for life, put to death because of blasphemy laws. And again, those blasphemy accusations happen because people are expressing their own beliefs, and no one should be punished for that. And equally problematic is that when these laws are on the books, no matter whether they're enforced vigorously or not, it often gives encouragement to people to take the law in their own hands. And we have in stories in India and much more in Pakistan here, where there have been mobs and riots that have led to people being killed because of accusations they think are blasphemous, or violate their religious tenets. Muslims put to death on accusations, most, as far as we can determine, being false, of slaughtering cows in India, and the widespread violence over the last years in Pakistan, in which people have been killed by those in the surrounding communities on accusations, many of them false, just settling up personal grudges or business disputes with these false accusations. But whether false or true, here are people being butchered by mobs in the neighborhood, etc. And again, we have very inspiring stories of, let's say, Muslim leaders in Pakistan and Lahore last year that we describe in this year's report. 3 very prominent Muslim figures who stepped between a mob and Christians accused of blasphemy and persuaded the mob to disperse. Or the group in Kenya when Al-Shabaab took over a bus and they tried to separate the Muslim passengers from the Christian passengers, knowing they were likely to slaughter the Christian passengers. The Muslim passengers refused to be separated, and eventually, thank God, although 2 people were killed tragically, but they did not end up slaughtering the people because of the courage of those people. So there are inspiring countries of heroic political leaders and civil society leaders and just individual people who have stood up against this kind of extremism. We do a lot of training, Welton, to countries across the world to try and offer non-criminal ways to deal with these kinds of disputes, or when people are offended by what others, the way they practice their religion, or say something they think is defamatory against the religion that is a majority religion. And, how can it be dealt with in ways that seeks reconciliation and greater understanding here, in which, like in America, we mobilize civil society and political and religious leaders to drown out bad speech with good speech. And the organization that you led for so many years, the Interfaith Alliance, was often at the head of the efforts to do exactly that in America, and that's an inspiring example to the world.
David, you alluded to this by implication a while ago, and I want to pick up on it again. Is there an instance you think of where you could describe American diplomacy having a concrete impact on improving a particular situation?
There are many cases. I mean, first, there's a range of people who are quietly behind the scenes we've been able to help with the release of religious prisoners of conscience. Some make the news. Saeed Abedini is part of the prisoner release in Iran, and others. Some are just done very quietly. I was in the courtroom in Khartoum when the 2 most prominent religious prisoners of conscience at that time had the charges thrown out by the judge here, and that we heard from a number of civil society leaders that the attention to that case or similar cases in Sudan. Think of Miriam Ibrahim, who was accused of blasphemy and sentenced to death and was eventually released by a court. Civil society believes that the international pressure that the United States was often in the leadership on this issue played a role in creating conditions that empowered the judges to be able to reach these decisions. And we have a number of examples around the world where that happens. Secondly, a lot of our engagement does lead to changes in policy, or governments being more assertive in protecting vulnerable communities, particularly in the social hostilities area there. And I mean, think of our engagement with right now, if you look at a group that is facing this persecution, Rohingya Muslims in Burma, we've been working very hard to encourage the new government to take much more vigorous steps to help protect the communities there. And we're beginning to see some of the benefits of that engagement with taking the government now for the first time taking steps and clarifying exactly who's a citizen and who isn't a citizen, and setting up a process for people to be able to establish their citizenry documentation in a way that wasn't possible before. There are a number of cases right now we're engaged supporting the government of Vietnam, who has had many problematic policies that we have been concerned about for many years, but now they're writing a new bill, and each version of the new bill on religious freedom has gotten better and better, addressing some of the issues that we've been raising for years. They've have brought in international religious freedom scholars to consult with and talk with the people drafting the laws. So, no one knows in the end. It'll be voted on this fall, but if some of these improvements that are already there and some of the other ones that we know are being discussed actually go through, will make life better for millions of people there. And we're constantly trying through whatever means possible, through the support of the interfaith coalitions in the Central African Republic, in Nigeria, that have tried to respond to the violence there and do it with a unified religious voice. And very often we try to be helpful to those groups, to encourage them to form and provide training sometimes through NGO groups for some of these groups, for some of these undertakings across the globe. So, as I said, it's a difficult time. Human rights and religious freedom in the main is not expanding around the world. We face enormous challenges, but we look for every opportunity we have to make a difference, to lift up the plight of those who are being victimized and to put a human face on it, and to try and encourage the international community to be more assertive on these issues. We formed the International Contact Group of 27 countries working together on these issues over the last year and a half, with the Canadian government playing a lead role on that. And we every day we're continuing to work on these issues. David,
the truth is you've been doing this work basically all of your professional life, not in this office, obviously, but everywhere you've been an advocate for religious freedom and an opposition to those who don't allow that where they are. When you look at the big picture, and I hope this is not just an impossible question, but when you look at the big picture of religious liberty in our world, are you encouraged? Are you dismayed? Are you pessimistic? What are your feelings as you look at all of this and try to put it all together?
Truly mixed. I see increasing restrictions on human rights and religious freedom in too many countries across the globe. But I remain encouraged by many manifestations of the strength of religion and religious freedom in ways that are very encouraging. I mentioned some. The heroic example of just people at the grassroots level, or religious leaders in various levels in countries who mobilize interfaith cooperation, stand up for people of other religions, are willing to put their lives on the line. This is not the kind of discourse and debate we have in the United States. Mm-hmm. Very often the perpetrators of religious oppression are willing to use force, either the force of government coercion to oppress or imprison or brutalize minority communities that they disagree with, or social hostility. And one side's willing to use violence and killing and horrific crimes, and the other side is trying to use nonviolent means to assert their rights and the rights of others. So there's not parity between these different forces, which is why our goal is to really push on the government to use their power to offer protection to these groups. And every time that we see an improvement, as I said, in different countries, it is very encouraging, because a slight improvement in the rules and regulations that governments use to run religion opens up doors that make it possible for religions to organize in a way that wouldn't be possible before. I think the most affirming thing is I've been to a number of countries across the globe that have serious problems in this area. And there's hardly a country that I go to, including countries on our list of 10 countries. 10 is an arbitrary number. It's whoever meets the criteria of systemic, egregious, ongoing violations of human rights by the government, that are, we call, countries of particular concern. And another block of countries that have very serious problems and may be approaching that line. And there's hardly a country, I can't think of any, that I've been to where the pagodas, the temples, the mosques, the churches are not filled with people. People praying, and often young people in some of the most oppressive countries, young families here. And the power of that is, as well as the bravery of it here, the power of it is absolutely inspiring. So it's hard to think of, it is possible that countries succeed in regulating religious life in some regards here, but they can't quash it anywhere. I mean, just look at China, which has had a number of problems over the years. Even so, it depends on the region. There are areas of China in which restrictions are far less than in other areas, and you see religion flourish, and religious groups get involved in social services that benefit the people of China and partners with the government in this kind of work. Even while we see, famous examples of the Tibetan Buddhist community and the Uyghur Muslim community and the Falun Gong community here, in the tearing down of the crosses in Wenzhou. I traveled to that province to meet with the province leadership there to see what we could do to be helpful, and it is terribly difficult. But even so, the churches are filled with people. China now acknowledges with some pride that demographers differ a little bit, in the next 20 years or so, China will be the most populous Christian nation in the world here. So, in the long run, I think that easing those restrictions will be helpful to China. Not only avoid dividing the country along religious lines, but the benefit of the religious community's contribution to the future of China will be greatly magnified as well. And I think it's a win-win for China, and we try to make that argument. And there's some in the government who see that, and in regional governments who see that, and some who clearly, looking at the challenges to religious freedom there, people is not seen by many of the leaders. We hope that the broader vision of religious freedom will prevail there and across the globe.
Since 2015, Rabbi David Saperstein is Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom. Those of us who know him well know that he has been working on religious freedom for all of his life. In 1999, Rabbi Saperstein was elected as the first chair of the Commission on Religious Freedom. He's an attorney, is an educator for 30 years. He was the effective leader of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. David, you're doing such incredibly important work. You are the right person at the right moment in that office. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on State of Belief Radio, and how personally I miss you. Thanks for doing this.
Honored to be on the air with you again.